Hello and welcome to a deck profile for the standard format. Today we're talking about Aelqulibra. This is a very aggressive Dragon Empire deck that aims to pump up its own units with the overcharge ability to hit tremendous numbers with 5 attacks that doesn't rely on counterblast to function. It only needs 1 CV for the divine skill, and the rest of the deck does not require counterblast except for additional value. And it has its own good countercharger in order to refund the costs of those counterblast effects that are going to plus us cards. So it's really resource efficient. Its restander costs energy though, so while that means that you can use it even when you're not being damage denied, or even when you're being damage denied, it does mean that as the game goes on, you eventually run out of energy and you lose power as the game continues. So after turn 5 or so, the deck begins to plummet in power level. So this is a deck that wants to press the opponent hard early and end games quickly. And it has the tools to do so, but it does make it somewhat of a high rolly deck. If the opponent hits heals and the defensive OT, it can sometimes ruin our game plan. Nonetheless, it's a very fun deck to play. It's very quick and aggressive, and you can finish your round in 10 minutes and then go get lunch. Without any further ado, let's get into the video, starting with our ride deck. You can play any starter you want, it doesn't matter. And then our grade 1 is Rakuten Ver for Dragon. This is an overcharge unit that calls itself out from Soul when you ride over it with the grade 2, which is very important because we need overcharge units in play for our various effects. Having a guaranteed one from our ride line is critical. And it gets an additional 10k when it's chosen by the Vanguard, which is how the overcharge mechanic works. Overcharge units get an additional effect if you chose them with your Vanguard skill. The grade 1s are all going to be 23k numbers. The other 2 grade 1s will have other effects, and on top of that, this one is just a 23k unit base, which is still good enough. And then we have our grade 2 Gatling Kanone Dragon. This unit, you have to play this because it's referenced by the grade 1. And when you ride over this with Aelqulibra, you look at the top 3 cards, choose a grade 3 or less, add it to hand, and then you put the rest on the bottom. And you, if you picked an overcharge unit, you soul charge 1. Just a nice way to find any missing pieces you haven't found by turn 3. But important to note that we don't really shuffle in this deck, so those cards that go to the bottom are probably gone forever. And then we have Destined One of Scales Aelqulibra, our main Vanguard. Has the Axe skill, Soul Blast 2, choose 3 rear guards, and they get 5k until end of turn. And if you chose 2 or more rear guards with overcharge ability, you draw a card and it gets 10k until end of turn. So your board is going to be huge just from this effect alone, because all the overcharge units get additional power in addition to being chosen by the Vanguard, giving them 5k. So the grade 1s are going to be 23k, and the grade 2s are going to be 20k without any other modifiers. And then the Divine skill, if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, you counterblast 1, choose 2 of your rear guards, and they get 5k. And then if your opponent's damage zone is 4 or less cards, choose one of your opponent's Vanguards and deal it a damage. And then if they hit a trigger, you reduce that trigger's power by 10,000. So right off the bat, you can see how this deck's game plan works. We're trying to hit big numbers to push the opponent up, and then we're trying to force them up damage with this effect to put them in a state where they have to guard those big numbers or die. So this is going to create virtual card advantage, where our opponent is going to deplete their hand to survive, and thus potentially not have as many resources to attack us back with. If we go first, our numbers are going to be in the 23k plus range, which means we're going to be either forcing them up to 3 or 4 on turn 3 or draining their hand. And then on turn 4, we're forcing them up to 4 or 5, which puts them into lethal range and makes the whole deck scarier. This is also the only must-activate ability in the deck that costs Counterblast. We can save Counterblast for card advantage effects everywhere else in the deck, so it makes us really resilient to resource manipulation from the opponent. Next up, we have our main Vanguard. Again, 3 more copies of them for Persona Ride purposes. This is really important for the deck to hit Persona Ride because it helps us build Soul to pay for the cost of the first skill, which is Soul Blast 2, pretty heavy. And also it's just going to help us push those numbers up from the hard-to-guard range to the unguardable range. Next up is our Overcharge package, starting with the most important Overcharge unit, the Restander Dragritter Shalhub, 4 copies. This unit has the ability that it gets 5k more power if you have 3 or more units with the Overcharge ability, and it counts itself. And it has the overcharge effect that when your Vanguard attacks a grade 3 or greater unit, if you chose this unit with your Vanguard this turn, you can Energy Blast 3 and stand at this unit and it gets 10k. So it's a easy restander. It'll give us 5 attacks because it's not capped at 1 restand per battle, or 1 restand per turn. It's just if you have 2 of them in play, you can activate both of them. But it uses energy, so as the game goes on, we start running out of energy. We're spending 6 every turn, but we're only gaining 3, so we'll eventually run out. But we will get at least 2 turns of back-to-back 5 attacks. And it's a restander that gets bigger on the restand, so we can do things like boost to the first swing, and then still have a respectable restand swing after the fact. And this additional power, combined with the 23k boosters, the overcharge, plus Persona Ride, will let us hit 63,000, which is a really hard number to guard. The overtrigger can't guard that. They need the overtrigger and 5k more. Next up is our card draw grade 1. This is Drag Raider Eagle. When you place this on R, if you have 2 or more units with the overcharge ability, which we always will because the ride line has an overcharge unit that calls itself out, you counterblast 1, draw a card, and soul charge 1. And then its overcharge effect is that if it was chosen by your Vanguard this turn, it gets another 10k. So it's at least a 23k, and it draws a card. That's pretty solid. Next, we have our countercharger, Drag Ritter Farliza. This has the overcharge ability. When it boosts, if it was chosen by your Vanguard, it gets another 10k, so it'll be a 23k booster. And then the end of battle, if you haven't countercharged this turn, retire this unit and countercharge. So it's a once per turn countercharge, but that's not a big deal because we're not super reliant on counterblast. We only need 1 CB or 2 CB a turn at most, and this will refund the cost of one of our abilities. And most counterchargers are not hitting huge power numbers. It's actually pretty uncommon for a deck to get a good countercharger that also has a really high power. Next up is the last card in our overcharge package, the Order to Equilibrize the Scales of the World at 3 copies. This is a counterblast 1, pick up 2 overcharge units from your drop with different names and call them to R. Really solid recursion effect. Always a +1 because you're getting back 2 cards for 1 card. And sometimes a +2 if you call Eagle, because Eagle will draw a card again when you place them. So you can potentially turn this 1 order into a +2, which is really solid. It's a good way to rebuild your board if your opponent's been retiring your units. It lets you mitigate the downside of riding up because you can call the cards you discarded in the ride phase and build a board out of that. And that's much needed because we're not playing the energy cycler in this deck. We can't really afford to spare the energy, and we can't always afford to spare the counterblast. So I didn't play any energy cyclers on my list, but some lists in Japan, a lot of lists in Japan actually have been playing the energy cycler, so you can consider it over this card. But you need something to recoup the losses of discarding. So either the cycler, because you can pay counterblast and draw a card, or this card because you can call the cards you discarded earlier to get back the cards that you lost. You need to play one of those two. And then we have our filler slots. 4 copies of Forward and Revertus. This card soul charges 1 on place and gets 5k if you place it from hand other than during the battle phase. And then you can counterblast 1 and choose one of the 2 effects. Choose one of your opponent's grade 2 or greater rear guards and retire it, or choose a grade 2 or less card from your soul and call it to R. So it can help us build a board potentially, it can fuel our Soul Blast costs for later, and it can clear the opponent's units from play. So it does a lot of different things that we need sometimes, but this card is pretty expensive, I acknowledge. So if you don't want to play it, you can just play Brachioforce. Brachioforce will draw cards on hit, and it will retire the opponent's units. And because we hit big numbers, you can make Brachioforce pretty hard to guard. So that's a viable backup option, and it won't cost Counterblast or Soul or anything too, so it'll be easier on your resources. But I think Forward and Revertus is a little bit better. At the very least, even if we don't have a good unit in Soul to call out or anything to retire on the opponent's side, a unit that Soul charges 1 and gets 5k on place is good enough for this deck because we just want something to pressure the opponent. This will help us hit over defensives, especially if we boost it. Next, we have 4 copies of Stealth Fiend Shenri. When this unit boosts, if your opponent has 1 or less rear guards, or if you played an order this turn, it gets 5k, and then at the end of the battle, you put this into Soul and draw a card. So it's a 13k booster, which is really nice on the early turns because it'll help everything hit over at defensive, and then it'll build Soul for our Vanguard later. And we do play a normal order, so even in the late game, we can trigger this effect. And then lastly, we have 1 copy of Dancing Princess of Elegant Flames, Justina. This is an order searcher. When you place it on R from hand, if you didn't play an order this turn, you discard a card, search for a non-Regalis piece of order, discard it, and then you can play it from drop and put it on the bottom of the deck after. So this is just a way to guarantee that we can find our to equilibrize the scales of the world. And also it'll deck thin, and also it'll be our one way to shuffle the deck to get those cards back from the ride lines bottom effect. And if we already have the order, we can just discard this to perfect cards or something, it's fine. But it's a nice little way to play a 4th copy of an order without playing more cards that don't have any shield value. And then we have our defensive package, 3 perfect guards and 1 elementaria. Self-explanatory, almost every deck plays this ratio. Then we have 1 copy of Defensing Roar. This has the effect, you choose one of your guardians without sentinel, and until end of the battle, it gets when it's retired from guardian, it goes back to your hand, and then it gets 10k shield. So this combined with a front trigger can let you guard with a 20k shield twice, which is really nice. It's especially good with the over trigger. You can guard with the over trigger, which is basically a perfect guard, and then pick up the over trigger again and guard with it one more time. So it's just a really solid way to inflate the defensive power of the deck for very little cost. And then we have 1 copy of Protection Twincast, which is a Blitz Order Regalis piece. We're playing normal orders, so if we play a Bracing Angel Ladder or a Radiance Caliburn or Gracious Gerdale, those will conflict with our ability to play to equilibrize the scales of the world, and we'll have to pick one or the other, and that can be a big problem sometimes. So this is a Regalis piece that doesn't conflict with our normal order choice. But if you cut the order for Energy Cyclers, that's not a problem you'll have to face. This one just gives us a little bit more defensive power for no resource cost, and we can discard it for costs without feeling bad because it has an effect in the drop zone. This unit, when you play it as a Blitz Order, you choose one of your units being attacked and you give it 10k, and then when it's in your drop zone, you can remove it from play when you're being attacked to get 5k for each grade of the unit that is being attacked. So it's a nice little bonus shield value. And then we have 1 copy of Red Jeweled Beast Gallnet. This is the ride line returner for Dragon Empire. When you call this to R or place it on G, you put 2 cards from your ride deck that are in your drop or soul back into your ride deck face up, and then it gets either 15k shield if it was on G, which makes it a 20k shield total, or you draw a card if it's on R. And we can reuse this Defensing Roar if all the cards in our ride deck are out in circulation somehow, either in the drop zone or in the soul. We can play this once, use Defensing Roar, pick it back up, and play it again, which is really nice. You're generally only going to do that if your grade 1 from the ride line has been retired at some point somehow. Next up is our triggers. We have 4 vanilla heals. Shoujo Doji is the best deck in the format and isn't affected by any of the effect heals, so just play vanillas. Then we have 8 crits. It honestly doesn't matter what crits you play. You can play 8 vanilla crits if you want. I'm playing the effect crits because they're shiny, and that's literally the only reason. And then we have 3 fronts. Fronts versus draws is an interesting subject for this deck because we hit such big numbers that fronts are somewhat unnecessary, but by playing fronts we maximize the usage of Defensing Roar, which is really nice, and we can sometimes push a number that was going to deplete all the cards in the opponent's hand but leave them alive into a number that will kill them. And then we have the Dragon Empire Overtrigger, Dragon Deity, King of Resurgence, Drag Beta. This gives your Vanguard a restand with no minus drives, which is one of the most powerful overtrigger effects in the game. You can tell it's so good because they keep designing decks that don't really function with it. So this is easily the best option we can play in this deck. It's really solid, and just getting 1 more attack is often enough to slam the door shut on the opponent. So that is the deck. I'll cover what the attack pattern for this deck will look like real quick. We're going to assume we have some cards in damage. It doesn't really matter what. If we're on our first grade 3 turn going first, then we can't do any multi-attacks because our restander requires us to attack a grade 3 unit. So on the first grade 3 turn, you're just looking to get a board of overcharge units in play. And you're going to have 1 guaranteed from your ride line. And you're just trying to set up big numbers. So if you have any copies of Shenri, you can throw those in there too to boost. But you're just going to do something like swing Vanguard, drive check 2 cards, it doesn't matter what they are, and then swing and swing. If you have used your overcharge ability of your Vanguard, then the numbers will look like this. This will be +5 from the Vanguard, +10 from itself. And the same will go for these other 2 grade 1s. And the Vanguard will give itself 10k. If your opponent is on grade 2, these numbers are all very hard to guard. A 15k shield from your opponent on grade 2 will only be a 1 to pass, which is really solid. And then this will be hitting over defensive, and this will be hitting over a lot of shield value. This will be a total of 46, which means the opponent will have to guard with 2 triggers and then still have to guard with another card. So that's what the grade 3 return will look like going first. This will retire to countercharge if we have spent counterblast for this effect at all. And then the Persona Ride turn will look a bit like this. We're going to try to get 2 restanders in play. We will, then after we have 2 restanders, we'll just need to get 1 more overcharge unit. Ideally, the countercharger should be one of these overcharge units so that we can continue recycling our resources, but it's completely unnecessary, and we can function perfectly fine on this turn if we just have 2 restanders and 2 overcharge units to boost them. Ideally, we have this though, and then we will do something like this. We'll activate our divine skill, which will then choose 3 units. We'll choose our 2 restanders, which will get 5k from the Vanguard and 5k from their own effect from having 3 or more in play, and then we'll pick one of the overcharge units boosting one of these columns. Then we'll activate divine skill. We'll choose another 2 units to give 5k, and if we have any overcharge units in play that have not been chosen yet, we will choose those because that gives us the biggest bang for our buck. Now, if we do this, our Vanguard should also have 10k from his own effect. Our board is tremendous, and we've dealt the opponent a damage too, so we've forced them up to a favorable damage range. So now, if our opponent's at 5, we can do something like this. We can swing boosted first, and this is 10, 20, 30, 45, 53, which is a really hard number to guard. And also, they have to guard it if they're at 5 or they die. So they're under a lot of pressure right off the bat. They won't be able to try to hit a defensive. So they either have to gamble on a 6 damage heal or just have all the perfect guards in their hand right now. But if the opponent is at like 4 or something, we can do something like this instead. We can swing with these first, and they'll be 30k each, which is still an inconvenient number. It's a 15k shield plus some change. And that's going to be tempting for the opponent to take, which will then put them in a really bad spot. But these will be the smallest numbers of the turn, so most likely the opponent will have to just suck it up and pay the 15k shield plus an intercept or whatever to guard them. Then we swing Vanguard, and we Energy Blast 6 to restand both of our units, and they give themselves another 10k. The Vanguard here is swinging boosted for 10, 20, 33, 48, 56, which is a really good number. If the opponent guards the overtrigger, that's a 1 to pass, which is absurd. And then we'll drive check 2 cards, and honestly, it doesn't matter what these are. These numbers are going to be huge anyways already. So we could drive check 2 blanks, and it's perfectly fine. Still going to put the opponent under a ton of pressure. And then now, when we swing with these columns, they are 30, 40, 55, 63s, which is a really good magic number. Basically, it'll get through the highest shield value card that most decks have access to that isn't a perfect guard, and the opponent will have to do that twice to survive this turn. And then, in the event that the opponent survives all this, we can do this pattern one more time, but with slightly less power. We won't have a divine skill anymore for the rest of the game, so we can only pick 3 units to give power to, so we'll be picking our restanders, and one of these restanders will have a very strong booster and the other won't. But that will hopefully be enough to finish the opponent off, especially if we were able to Persona Ride a second time. And after this point, we're a 4-attack deck because we'll be at 0 energy after this turn, and then we'll be gaining 3 every turn, so we can only use 1 restander. So you can see how our potential for pressure falls off dramatically after the second Persona Ride turn. After this, we are a very mediocre deck, but the previous turn was such high power and such high pressure that it probably doesn't matter. If we have somehow not been killed by our opponent, it's very likely that they are the ones who are dead now. As you can see, this deck isn't that hard to play. It's really just a matter of getting your overcharge units into play and then targeting everything with your Vanguard skills. And if you can do that, you'll hit tremendous numbers, and the pressure is on the opponent to find a way to survive rather than on you to find a way to kill them. Because all you're doing is slamming your cards down and turning them sideways, which can make this a very appealing deck if you want something that's fun but doesn't require a lot of effort. You just want something that you can pick up and play and have a good time without having to like memorize a 10-step combo line or anything like that. This deck also has plenty of room for customizability in the current iteration because we have about 8 slots or so, 8 or 12 slots, depending on how you look at it, that are flex slots. These Shenry slots, these forward and reverse slots, and the order package are all optional cards. On top of that, so is the defensive package. You don't really need to play any of these. So aside from triggers, perfect guards, and cards with overcharge in their text, and our Vanguard itself, we don't really have anything that is mandatory. So this is a lot of room to adjust the deck to how you like it. You could play even more defensive cards if you want to be very tanky. You could play more, you can play cyclers to get some value out of discarding. You can consider the Soul Blast Cycler because we do build Soul, so we can mitigate the downside of this. But it's not very good to draw in the late game, but it will give you some value on the write-up. You can play the Energy Cyclers, as I've mentioned. You can play other overcharge cards. There's one, you can either play more of the grade 1 from the Ride line, which is not in this pile, it's in this pile. The Rakuten Verve Dragon. You can play more copies of this in the main deck just to have more overcharge units. Or you could play the grade 3, which has like Energy Blast and it gets more power, I believe. Or something like that. I don't think it's very good, so I didn't play it, but it's in some lists from Japan, so it's worth considering. You can make 2 Gauntlets work in this deck because you can call over the Rakuten Verve and Soul Blast out your Vanguard after you Persona Ride, and you can get the last 2 Ride deck cards out into the drop so you can maximize the value of this. You can play more Defensing Roars. There's a lot of room for options. This deck doesn't really have much besides the overcharge package that is mandatory. Well, that's it for now. This deck is a blast to play. I strongly encourage building it and giving it a spin. You don't have to be intimidated by the price tag of Forward and Revertus because you can just replace them with Brachio Forces and it's perfectly fine. And you don't need Energy Cyclers for this deck, so that's another expensive card that you can cut from the list. And so I think you should pick it up. I think you should take it to your locals and have a great time with it because it's so fun, it's so aggressive, and it's very funny to say attack for 63 and watch the opponent sweat for 2 minutes trying to figure out how to survive. But that's it for today. As always, good luck card fighting.